Late May, 1944. Observation bunker, Pointe du Hoc, Normandy, France. Oberleutnant Frido Eberling stood at the western edge of the concrete fortification, binoculars pressed against his eyes as he surveyed the sheer limestone cliffs plunging 100 feet to the narrow beach below. The morning mist clung to the English Channel, obscuring the horizon where Allied ships would surely appear when the invasion came. Behind him, young gunners from the 2nd Battery, Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260 went about their morning routines, confident in the fortress they defended. Eberling lowered his binoculars and permitted himself a slight smile. No force could scale these cliffs under fire. The position was impregnable from the sea. The Americans, if they came here at all, would be slaughtered on the rocks below. The mathematical certainty of German defensive victory at Pointe du Hoc was written not in strategy manuals, but in the simple physics of vertical assault. 100 feet of sheer rock face, covered by overlapping fields of machine gun fire, defended by 200 seasoned soldiers of the 716th and 352nd Infantry Divisions, protected by minefields and wire obstacles on the landward approaches. Every military calculation confirmed what seemed obvious to anyone standing atop these cliffs. The position could not be taken from the sea, yet in just days that mathematical certainty would collide with American determination in one of the most audacious assaults in military history, a vertical battle that would redefine the limits of human courage and tactical possibility. The German confidence had deep roots. On June 10, 1940, following the defeat of France, Wehrmacht engineers first surveyed the commanding heights of Pointe du Hoc. The promontory jutted into the English Channel between the beaches that would later be designated Utah and Omaha, a natural fortress with clear fields of fire extending more than 12 miles in every direction. From this position, coastal artillery could devastate any amphibious landing within range. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed Inspector General of the Atlantic Wall Defences in late 1943, personally inspected Pointe du Hoc on March 11, 1944. His diary, discovered in German military archives in 1973, recorded his assessment with characteristic precision. The cliffs provide natural defence superior to any fortification we could construct. Enemy assault from the sea is tactically impossible. Our concern must be defence against airborne or inland attack. 6 captured French 155mm GPF howitzers were emplaced atop Pointe du Hoc by late 1942, each capable of firing a 95-pound shell to a range of approximately 20,000 yards. 4 guns were positioned in open concrete emplacements, while 2 were being enclosed in massive H671 casemates, reinforced concrete structures designed to withstand direct hits from naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The construction alone demonstrated German confidence in holding this position indefinitely. By spring 1944, Pointe du Hoc had evolved into a fortress complex that seemed to validate every assumption about its impregnability. The position included an H636 observation bunker with panoramic views of the invasion beaches, L409 mounts for 20mm flak, 30 anti-aircraft guns, interconnecting trenches and tunnels, ammunition bunkers built into the cliff face itself, and minefields covering every conceivable approach from inland. The garrison consisted of approximately 125 infantry from the 726th Grenadier Regiment of the 716th Infantry Division and 85 artillerymen from the 2nd Battery, Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260, with additional support from elements of the 352nd Infantry Division positioned in reserve just behind the position. Unteroffizier assigned to defend the eastern approach wrote to his wife on May 28, 1944. "We have the best position on the entire Atlantic Wall. Let the Americans come if they dare. They will find nothing but death on our cliffs. Every man here knows these rocks are our fortress, and no enemy can climb them under our fire." The tactical mathematics seemed unassailable. Allied planners had calculated that any assault force attempting to scale the cliffs would be exposed to defensive fire for a minimum of 15 minutes, likely 30, possibly more if ropes failed or men slipped. During that time, defenders at the cliff edge could fire directly down upon climbers who had no cover, no ability to maneuver, and limited capacity to return fire. German defensive plans called for machine gun positions spaced every 75 metres along the cliff edge, ensuring overlapping fields of fire that left no dead ground. Stick grenades could simply be dropped over the edge. Even rocks, pushed from the top, would become lethal projectiles. One Feldwebel had calculated that a single defender could kill or wound 10 attackers during such an assault, meaning the 200-man garrison could theoretically inflict 2,000 casualties before being overwhelmed. But across the English Channel, a very different calculation was being made. In the heavily guarded planning rooms of Allied Supreme Headquarters in London, Operation Overlord was taking shape. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, and his staff had identified Pointe du Hoc as one of the most dangerous German defensive positions on the Normandy coast. Those 6 155mm guns, if they remained operational on D-Day, could rain destruction upon both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. A single battery firing with accuracy could sink landing craft, destroy tanks before they left the water, and turn the narrow beaches into killing grounds. The mathematics of invasion demanded the elimination of Pointe du Hoc's guns before the main landings began. General Omar Bradley, commanding U.S. First Army and responsible for the American sector, faced a decision that would haunt him for years. The cliffs were too high and too well defended for a conventional infantry assault. Paratroopers could be dropped inland to attack from behind, but the close terrain of Norman hedgerows made that approach uncertain at best. Naval gunfire and aerial bombardment might damage the position, but concrete casemates were designed to survive such attacks. Only one option offered certainty of success, but it seemed to violate every principle of military tactics. A small force would have to land at the base of the cliffs, scale them under fire, and destroy the guns in close combat. When Bradley explained this mission to Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder on February 3, 1944, the general's discomfort was obvious. Rudder, a 34-year-old reserve officer from Brady, Texas, commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion, an elite unit of 545 men specially trained for difficult missions. Bradley looked across the map table at the young officer and said what both men were thinking. This could be the most dangerous mission of the entire invasion. Naval planners are telling me it cannot be done. One even said 3 old women with brooms could keep the Rangers from climbing those cliffs. Rudder studied the reconnaissance photographs spread before him, aerial images showing the stark vertical walls of Pointe du Hoc rising from the narrow beach. He noted the gun emplacements, the observation bunker, the defensive positions along the cliff edge. Then he looked up at Bradley and spoke words that would echo through military history. "My men can do it, sir." The planning that followed was as unprecedented as the mission itself. Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, a total of 225 men, would form Force A and assault Pointe du Hoc directly. They would be supported by the 5th Ranger Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, designated Force C, which would follow if the assault succeeded or divert to Omaha Beach if it failed. Landing was scheduled for 6:30 a.m. on D-Day, designated H-hour, with naval gunfire support from the battleship USS Texas and destroyers USS Satterlee and HMS Talibont. But the challenge that obsessed Rudder and his staff was simple and seemingly insurmountable. How do you climb 100 feet of sheer cliff while men above you are trying to kill you? The Rangers began training in April 1944 on the cliffs near Swanage on the southern coast of England. British commandos, veterans of coastal raids against German positions in Norway and France, shared their hard-won expertise in cliff assault techniques. The commandos had developed specialized equipment and tactics, but they were candid about the challenges. "Climbing under fire is not like mountain climbing," Captain David Niven of the British Commandos told a group of Rangers during a training session. Your enemy is not the rock, but the man at the top trying to kill you. Speed is your only defense, and even speed may not be enough. The Rangers tested every conceivable climbing method and developed rocket-propelled grappling hooks. A small rocket motor attached to a grapnel and rope could be fired from a launcher, sending the grappling hook over the cliff edge where it would catch on rocks or obstacles. Multiple ropes would create a network of climbing lines. Through April and May 1944, the Rangers practiced on the Swanage Cliffs dozens of times. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, a 24-year-old from Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, commanding D Company's 2nd Platoon, recorded the evolution of their technique in letters home. "We have climbed these cliffs so many times I dream about them," he wrote on April 23rd. "Today we tried wet ropes because ours will be soaked with seawater. They are slippery as ice, and 2 men fell, though neither was seriously hurt. Tomorrow we practice with full combat loads, 60 pounds of weapons and ammunition." The Rangers developed a technique of team climbing. One man would go up fast and light, carrying only a pistol or carbine, establishing a position at the top to provide covering fire. Others would follow with heavier weapons. The strongest climbers carried Browning automatic rifles. Each company was issued 10 thermite grenades, special incendiary devices that burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt gun mechanisms and weld steel components together. Colonel Rudder addressed the challenge in his final briefing on June 4, 1944, as the Rangers assembled for the journey across the Channel. "Gentlemen, I will not lie to you about what we face. The Germans will have every advantage. They will be above us, behind cover, with clear fields of fire. We will be exposed on ropes, carrying heavy loads, with no place to hide. Some of us will not reach the top. Some of us will not survive the day. But I know this with absolute certainty. If any fighting force on earth can take Pointe du Hoc, it is this battalion. We have trained for this mission for 3 months. We know the ground, we know our weapons, and we know each other. When we land on that beach, we will climb those cliffs faster than the Germans believe possible. We will reach the top before they can kill us all. And when we reach the top, we will complete our mission. Those guns will be destroyed. The invasion will succeed. Are you with me?" The response from 225 throats was instantaneous. "Rangers lead the way, sir." The journey across the English Channel began at 4:45 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Rangers boarded their landing craft assault vessels from the troop transport HMS Amsterdam in darkness and rough seas. Each LCA carried 22 men, 9 LCAs in total for the assault force, with 2 additional craft carrying supplies and 4 DUKW amphibious trucks mounting the 100-foot extension ladders from the London Fire Brigade. The seas were far rougher than training exercises, waves reaching 5 to 6 feet, and several Rangers became violently seasick in the crowded, heaving landing craft. Private First Class Harry Fate, a rifleman in E Company, later described the journey. "We were soaked before we were 10 minutes from the ship, sea spray washing over the low sides of the LCA. Men vomited. Others bailed water desperately to keep us from swamping. Around us in the darkness were thousands of ships, the greatest armada in history." At 5:50 a.m., as the first light touched the eastern sky, the naval bombardment of Pointe du Hoc began. USS Texas, a battleship mounting 10 14-inch guns, opened fire from a position 10,000 yards offshore. The massive shells, each weighing 1,400 pounds, screamed overhead and impacted the cliff top with earth-shaking explosions. In exactly 34 minutes, USS Texas fired 255 14-inch shells at Pointe du Hoc, averaging 7.5 shells per minute. The destroyers Satterlee and Talibont added their 5-inch guns to the barrage. The Rangers, struggling through rough seas in their landing craft, could see the cliff top erupting in fountains of earth and concrete debris. But the first critical mistake of the assault was already unfolding. In the darkness and confusion, Lieutenant Colin Beaver of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve commanding the lead motor launch guiding the assault force, had navigated incorrectly. Instead of heading directly toward Pointe du Hoc, the flotilla was travelling parallel to the coast toward Pointe de la Percée, 3 miles to the east. First Sergeant Lomell was among the first to notice the error. Looking through the spray at the cliffs ahead, he saw the wrong configuration of rock formations. He scrambled across the crowded LCA to the British coxswain. "That's not the point," Lomell shouted over the roar of the engine. "We are off course." Finally, as the error became obvious to others as well, Lieutenant Beaver acknowledged the mistake and ordered the course correction. But precious time had been lost. The assault, scheduled for H hour at 6:30 a.m., would not reach the beach until after 7 a.m. The delay meant the Rangers would climb in full daylight rather than the relative concealment of dawn. And 40 minutes after the naval bombardment ended, German defenders would have time to recover and man their positions. Company C, 2nd Rangers, which had been assigned to assault Pointe de la Percée, landed correctly at their objective at approximately 6:40 a.m. Captain Ralph Goranson led 70 men up those cliffs and seized their objective, but they were now separated from the main assault by 3 miles of enemy-held coast. Meanwhile, the Force C Rangers and the 5th Ranger Battalion, waiting offshore for the signal that Pointe du Hoc had been taken, never received that signal. Following their orders, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider made the painful decision to divert to Omaha Beach. The plan had called for his 500 men to reinforce success at Pointe du Hoc, but the 40-minute delay meant they would instead land at Omaha Beach's Dog White sector. There they would fight a different battle, one that may have been decisive in the eventual breakthrough at that bloodiest of landing beaches. But it meant the 225 men of Force A would assault Pointe du Hoc alone. At 7:10 a.m., the landing craft carrying Force A finally turned toward the correct objective. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc rose before them, stark and vertical in the morning light, their faces pockmarked and cratered from the massive bombardment. Smoke still drifted from the shattered bunkers at the top. The narrow strip of beach at the cliff base, perhaps 30 yards wide at low tide, was littered with rocks and bomb craters. Above it, the cliff face rose straight up, 100 feet of limestone and chalk. The 1st LCA, number 888, carrying Colonel Rudder and elements of E Company, ground onto the beach. The ramp splashed down into knee-deep water. Rudder was the first man off, running toward the cliff base through a hail of machine gun fire that erupted from positions along the cliff edge. The Germans had recovered from the bombardment faster than anyone had hoped. They were alive, they were alert, and they were ready. Lieutenant James Eichner, last off LCA 888, would recall the moment with perfect clarity. I ran down the ramp into water about up to my knees and headed across what beach there was to the cliff wall, which seemed like a mile away, but probably was no more than 50 to 70 yards. The Germans were firing down at us, machine guns mostly, but also rifles. I could hear rounds snapping past my head. Men were hit before they reached the cliff. The only thought in my mind was, get to the base of that cliff, because at least there the Germans cannot shoot straight down at you. Across a 500-yard front, 9 landing craft disgorged their loads of Rangers. The rocket-equipped grappling hooks fired immediately, small puffs of smoke and flame as the rockets ignited, sending the grapnels arcing toward the cliff top. Some ropes were soaked with seawater and fell short. Others caught on the irregular cliff edge, and Rangers immediately began climbing. The extension ladders on the DUKWS proved useless. Bomb craters from the naval bombardment had turned the beach into a moonscape, and the vehicles could not get close enough to the cliff base. The German response was immediate and devastating. Machine gun fire raked the beach and the cliff face. Maschinengewehr 42S, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, created curtains of bullets. Potato masher grenades came tumbling over the cliff edge, exploding among the climbing Rangers, and the Germans simply pushed rocks over the edge. Limestone chunks weighing 5, 10, 20 pounds became deadly projectiles when dropped from 100 feet. Several Rangers were struck by falling rocks and knocked from their ropes. But the Rangers at the beach and in the landing craft poured automatic weapons fire at any German who showed himself at the cliff edge. Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and M1 Garands created suppressing fire. Moreover, the destroyers Satterlee and Talibont had moved in dangerously close to shore and were firing their 5-inch guns at any bunker or position that showed activity. The tactical advantage began to shift. The Germans could not maintain effective fire on the climbers without exposing themselves to withering counterfire. At 7:25 a.m., 15 minutes after landing, the first Rangers reached the top. Sergeant Hayward Roby of E Company was among the first over the edge. He immediately encountered 3 German defenders preparing to drop grenades over the cliff. Roby opened fire with his Thompson, killing all 3 at point-blank range. Other Germans retreated from the cliff edge into the network of trenches and bunkers. Within 5 minutes, approximately 30 Rangers from D and E companies had established a toehold on the cliff top. But the Rangers' jubilation at reaching the top was short-lived. As they moved toward the massive gun emplacements, fighting through a landscape of craters and shattered concrete, they made a discovery that sent a shock through the assault force. The casemates were empty. The gun emplacements held only wooden telephone poles, crude decoys painted to resemble artillery pieces when viewed from the air. The 6 155mm guns, the entire reason for this assault, were gone. Lieutenant James Eichner, having reached the top with a group from E Company, ran toward gun emplacement number 4. His first thought was one of stunned disbelief. Jesus Christ, there's no guns here. We just climbed a 100-foot cliff under fire, lost half our men, and the damn guns aren't even here. For a moment I thought the whole mission had been for nothing. But the Rangers had not climbed Pointe du Hoc for nothing. The guns had been moved, but they had not been moved far, and they remained a mortal threat to the invasion beaches. Colonel Rudder, having reached the top and established his command post near the tip of the point, reorganized his forces on the fly. The mission had changed, but it had not failed. "Find those guns," he ordered. "They cannot be far. Destroy them wherever they are." By 7:45 a.m., Rangers from all 3 companies had reached the top, though at terrible cost. Of the 225 men who had landed, approximately 35 were already dead or wounded on the beach and cliff face. Another 15 had been hit after reaching the top. That left roughly 175 Rangers to accomplish a mission that had been designed for a full battalion. Companies D and E moved off the point itself and established roadblocks along the coastal highway. This was part of their original mission, to cut the road and prevent German reinforcements from moving between Utah and Omaha beaches. Staff Sergeant Len Lomell, despite his wound, led his platoon to a position astride the road approximately 200 meters south of Pointe du Hoc. By 8:15 a.m., about 35 Rangers from D and E companies had established a defensive perimeter along the highway. Lomell and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, his closest friend and the acting platoon sergeant, noticed a dirt road leading inland from the coastal highway. The road showed heavy track marks, as though something large and wheeled had passed recently. Both men had the same thought. The missing guns might have made those tracks. Without orders, operating on initiative and tactical instinct, they decided to investigate. At approximately 8:45 a.m., Lomell and Kuhn moved cautiously down the sunken lane, a typical Norman farm track enclosed by 9-foot-tall hedgerows. They moved using a leapfrog technique, one man advancing while the other covered. After advancing about 250 yards south of the coastal highway, Lomell abruptly stopped. He had seen something through a gap in the hedgerow. He turned to Kuhn and half-whispered words that would become legendary in Ranger history. "Jack, here they are. We've found them. Here are the goddamned guns." There, in an orchard camouflaged with netting, sat 5 of the 6 missing 155mm howitzers. They were positioned in a battery ready to fire, their barrels pointed northwest toward Utah Beach, with piles of ammunition stacked nearby. Incredibly, no Germans were visible in the immediate vicinity. About 100 meters away across an open field, Lomell could see approximately 100 German soldiers, apparently artillerymen and guards, gathered in what looked like a formation. They had no idea that 2 American soldiers were within grenade range of their artillery. Lomell assessed the situation instantly. He and Kuhn carried 1 thermite grenade each. 2 grenades were not enough to destroy 5 guns, but they could not wait. Every minute of delay increased the chance that these guns would open fire on the landing beaches. He turned to Kuhn. "Give me your grenade, Jack. Cover me. I'm going to fix them." While Kuhn crouched in position with his Thompson submachine gun, Lomell crawled to the first gun. He placed his thermite grenade in the gun's recoil mechanism, the complex assembly that absorbed the shock of firing. He pulled the pin. The thermite ignited silently, burning at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a flowing river of molten metal that seeped into every crevice of the mechanism, welding gears together, fusing moving parts into a solid, useless mass. He placed Kuhn's grenade in the traversing mechanism of the second gun and pulled that pin as well. Then, with both grenades expended, he pulled off his field jacket, wrapped it around the butt of his Thompson submachine gun, and systematically smashed the optical sights on all 5 weapons. The sights were precision instruments, impossible to replace in the field. Without them, the guns could not be aimed accurately. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Then Lomell and Kuhn withdrew as silently as they had come. But the mission was not complete. 3 guns were damaged, but they needed to be destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. Lomell and Kuhn reached their roadblock position and immediately began collecting thermite grenades from other Rangers. Most men had not used theirs. Within minutes, Lomell had a field jacket full of thermite grenades. He and Kuhn immediately headed back toward the orchard. They reached the gun position around 9 a.m. Again, incredibly, no Germans were present at the guns themselves. Kuhn took up his covering position, while Lomell methodically placed thermite grenades on the 3 guns he had previously damaged, ensuring their complete destruction. He pulled the pins and began to withdraw. Just as he climbed over the 9-foot hedgerow where Kuhn was waiting, the entire world exploded. A massive detonation threw both men off the hedgerow and into the sunken road. Debris, dirt, shell fragments and equipment rained from the sky. For a moment, both men lay stunned. Neither man knew that Sergeant Frank Rupinski, leading a patrol from E Company, had discovered a massive German ammunition dump near the gun position and had destroyed it with grenades. The explosion had been enormous. At 9:05 a.m., Lomell sent a runner back to Colonel Rudder with a message that would determine the success or failure of the entire Pointe du Hoc mission. Located guns, all destroyed, mission accomplished. Rudder, whose command post was under increasing German fire, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before the reality of their tactical situation reasserted itself. The guns were destroyed, the mission technically accomplished, but now 175 Rangers were isolated on a cliff top, surrounded by German forces of unknown strength, with dwindling ammunition and no prospect of immediate relief. Throughout the afternoon of June 6th, German counterattacks increased in intensity. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment probed the Ranger positions. Mortar fire pounded the roadblock positions. Snipers took up positions in the hedgerows. The observation bunker at the tip of Pointe du Hoc, a massive concrete structure that had survived the naval bombardment, still held German defenders. Rangers poured bazooka rounds and grenades through the firing slits, but the Germans inside refused to surrender. By nightfall on June 6th, Colonel Rudder faced the most difficult command decision of his life. Of his original 225 men, more than 1/3 were dead or wounded, though many of the wounded were still fighting. Communication with the roadblock force on the coastal highway was intermittent. Ammunition was running critically low, especially grenades and mortar rounds. The Germans held the high ground on 3 sides and were clearly preparing for a major counterattack. British Commando Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Trevor, who had come ashore with the Rangers as an observer, remarked with British understatement, "Never have I been so convinced of anything as that I will be either a prisoner of war or a casualty by morning." The night of June 6th to 7th was a desperate struggle for survival. German counterattacks came in waves. Flares lit the night sky. Machine gun tracers crisscrossed the darkness. The Rangers, exhausted from the climb and the day's fighting, took turns on watch. At approximately 11 p.m., a more serious counterattack developed. German infantry, estimated at company strength, advanced from the south toward the Ranger roadblock positions. The attack was preceded by mortar fire. Then came the assault, German infantry advancing in short rushes. The Rangers met them with everything they had. Browning automatic rifles fired in short, controlled bursts. M1 Garrons cracked steadily. Grenades arced through the darkness. The Germans came within 50 meters of the Ranger positions before the attack stalled. The Rangers had held, but at cost. Another 6 men were dead, 10 more wounded. Ammunition stocks were now critical. The 60mm mortars were down to their last few rounds. June 7th brought renewed German pressure. Counterattacks developed from multiple directions. The Germans were bringing up reinforcements, including elements of the 352nd Infantry Division. The tactical situation was becoming untenable. The roadblock force on the coastal highway, now numbering about 85 men, including the 23 Rangers from the 5th Battalion who had managed to reach them on the evening of June 6th, was in danger of being cut off. The command post perimeter on Pointe du Hoc, defending against attacks from the west, was down to about 90 men, many of them wounded. Colonel Rudder, himself wounded twice during the fighting, had to make a decision. Should he consolidate his forces into a single defensive position on Pointe du Hoc, or maintain the roadblock on the coastal highway despite the risk? He chose to hold both positions, gambling that reinforcements would arrive before his isolated companies were overrun. It was a decision that reflected both tactical necessity and the Ranger ethos. They had been given a mission to hold the coastal road. They would hold it until relieved or destroyed. The German attacks on June 7th were relentless. Machine gun positions that had been bypassed during the initial assault now opened fire from unexpected angles. Snipers were everywhere. The Rangers discovered that some German positions were connected by tunnels and trenches, allowing defenders to appear and disappear. By the evening of June 7th, the situation was desperate. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The last 60mm mortar rounds had been fired. Grenades were gone. Some Rangers were down to their last clips for their M1 rifles. Water was running low. Medical supplies were exhausted, and the wounded lay in crude aid stations with minimal treatment. The night of June 7th to 8th brought the crisis point. A coordinated German attack, estimated at battalion strength, struck the Ranger positions at midnight. This was no probing attack, but a deliberate assault designed to annihilate the Rangers. Artillery preparation pounded the defensive positions. Then came the infantry, advancing in mass behind the barrage. The Rangers, firing carefully to conserve their last ammunition, waited until the Germans were within 50 meters before opening fire. The volume of fire was devastating, but the Germans kept coming. First Sergeant Lomell, commanding a section of the roadblock, found himself down to 3 rounds for his Thompson and 1 grenade. When German infantry appeared within 20 meters of his position, he fired his last 3 rounds, then threw his last grenade, then picked up an M1 rifle from a dead Ranger and continued fighting. The attack broke less than 10 meters from the Ranger positions. The Germans, having taken murderous casualties, withdrew into the darkness. Behind them, they left dozens of dead and wounded. The Rangers, checking their ammunition, found they had collectively perhaps 100 rounds remaining for all weapons combined. Dawn on June 8th brought an almost eerie quiet to Pointe du Hoc. German pressure had ceased, not because they had given up, but because they were regrouping for what they assumed would be a final assault. The Rangers, almost out of ammunition and utterly exhausted, prepared for what they knew might be their last stand. Then, around noon, Observers at Pointe du Hoc spotted movement to the east. A column of troops was approaching along the coastal highway. For a terrible moment, the Rangers thought it was another German attack, one they could not possibly repel. Then someone spotted American helmets, Rangers from the 5th Battalion, accompanied by elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment and tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion, were advancing from Omaha Beach. The siege was over. The relief force that reached Pointe du Hoc found a scene that shocked even veteran soldiers. The landscape was cratered beyond recognition. The Rangers who emerged from their positions were unrecognizable, covered in mud and blood and cordite smoke, many wounded, all exhausted. When the reinforcements counted the survivors, the cost of the mission became clear. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed on June 6th, only 90 were still able to fight. But the mission had been accomplished. The guns were destroyed. The coastal highway was cut. German forces had been prevented from moving between the beaches at the critical moment when the invasion hung in the balance. And the Rangers had held their position for 2 days against overwhelming odds, demonstrating a level of determination and tactical skill that redefined what was thought possible. The strategic impact of the Pointe du Hoc assault extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives. The destruction of the 6 155mm guns eliminated a battery that could have devastated both Utah and Omaha beaches during the critical hours when troops were most vulnerable. Fire control officers estimated that those 6 guns, if operational and properly directed, could have sunk or damaged dozens of landing craft and killed thousands of soldiers on the beaches. The cutting of the coastal highway prevented German mobile reserves from reinforcing either beach at the moment when such reinforcement might have driven the Allies back into the sea. The 914th Grenadier Regiment, committed to counterattacking Pointe du Hoc, was unavailable to counterattack at Omaha Beach, where the outcome remained in doubt until late afternoon on June 6th. The Pointe du Hoc assault validated General Eisenhower's faith in specialized forces and innovative tactics over conventional approaches. In his memoirs, published in 1948, Eisenhower wrote of Pointe du Hoc, "The Rangers who scaled those cliffs demonstrated the warrior spirit that would carry us to victory. They proved that courage and initiative could overcome material disadvantage, that training and determination could defeat seemingly superior positions." General Omar Bradley, in his memoir published in 1951, was even more direct about the significance of the assault. "No soldier in my command has ever been wished a more difficult task than that which befell the 34-year-old commander of the Provisional Ranger Force." That Rudder's Rangers were able to accomplish their mission was not merely a tactical success, but a demonstration of the American soldiers' capability to execute the impossible when properly led and motivated. The Rangers themselves were more modest about their achievement. In oral histories recorded decades later, survivors consistently emphasized teamwork, training and luck over individual heroism. First Sergeant Lomell, who received the Distinguished Service Cross, the British Military Medal, and the French Legion of Honor for his destruction of the guns, always insisted that any Ranger could have done what he did. "We were all trained for exactly that mission," he said in a 1999 interview. "Jack Kuhn covered me. Other Rangers established the roadblock that allowed us to move inland. The naval gunfire kept the Germans off our backs. It was not one man's achievement, but a battalion's achievement. And we lost too many good men for any of us to take pride in individual awards." The physical landscape of Pointe du Hoc remains virtually unchanged today, preserved as a memorial to the Rangers who fought there. The craters from the naval bombardment still pockmark the ground. The shattered bunkers and casemates stand as they were left. The cliff face bears the scars of that June morning, and at the cliff edge, memorials honour both the Rangers who climbed and the men of all nations who fought on D-Day. On June 6, 1984, President Ronald Reagan visited Pointe du Hoc for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. 62 survivors of the 2nd Ranger Battalion who had climbed those cliffs sat in the audience as Reagan delivered one of his most memorable speeches. Standing at the cliff edge, Reagan spoke directly to the aging Rangers. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The strategic lessons of Pointe du Hoc extended far beyond June 1944. The assault validated specialized training for specific missions, proving that properly prepared forces could accomplish objectives that conventional forces could not. The U.S. Army Ranger concept became a permanent part of American military structure. Today's 75th Ranger Regiment traces its lineage directly to the 2nd Ranger Battalion and considers Pointe du Hoc a defining moment in Ranger history. The tactical innovations developed for Pointe du Hoc influenced military doctrine for decades. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Pointe du Hoc was not tactical or technological, but human. The assault demonstrated that properly motivated soldiers, given clear objectives and adequate training, could overcome obstacles that appeared insurmountable. The 1985 reunion of Pointe du Hoc veterans, held at Fort Hood, Texas, brought together more than 500 former Rangers, many accompanied by their families. These men, now in their 60s, had not seen each other in decades, but the bonds formed on that cliff face proved unbreakable. Colonel James Rudder had died in 1970, having served as president of Texas A&M University and as Texas Land Commissioner after the war. But his widow, Margaret Rudder, attended the reunion and spoke on his behalf. "Jim never talked much about Pointe du Hoc at home," she told the assembled Rangers. "But I know he was proud of what you all accomplished, and he was humbled by the men he lost. He used to say that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home." First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, then 65 years old, delivered a keynote address that captured the essence of what the Rangers had learned. "We went to Pointe du Hoc believing we faced an impossible mission. The Germans believed it was impossible too, and that confidence became their weakness. They could not conceive that anyone would attempt what we attempted, so they were not fully prepared for our success. We learned that day that impossible is often just another word for difficult, and difficult is just another word for requiring more courage and more determination than your enemy expects." The statistical record of Pointe du Hoc tells a story that numbers alone cannot fully capture. Of 225 Rangers who landed on June 6th, approximately 135 were killed or wounded during the two-day battle. The casualty rate exceeded 60%, among the highest of any unit on D-Day. The Rangers held their positions for approximately 48 hours before relief, isolated and surrounded, defending against an enemy force estimated at battalion to regimental strength. The 6 155mm guns were destroyed approximately 3 hours after the initial landing, completing the primary mission objective despite the guns having been relocated. The mission was accomplished by 2 men using thermite grenades, demonstrating that strategic impact does not always correlate with force size. The coastal highway was cut and held. No American or Allied landing craft or ship was hit by fire from Pointe du Hoc's guns on June 6th, validating the mission's strategic necessity. The human cost extended beyond the battle itself. Many Rangers who survived Pointe du Hoc were killed in subsequent operations. The 2nd Ranger Battalion fought through France and into Germany, participating in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where casualties were again devastating. Of the 90 Rangers who were still combat effective on June 8th, fewer than 40 survived the war unwounded. The legacy of Pointe du Hoc extends to every modern special operations unit. The 75th Ranger Regiment maintains a memorial to Pointe du Hoc at its headquarters. Every Ranger class visits Normandy as part of their training, standing at the cliff edge and looking down at the beach below. The Ranger Creed includes the line, "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy." That principle was forged at Pointe du Hoc, where Rangers repeatedly risked their lives to recover wounded comrades under fire. For the Germans, Pointe du Hoc represented the beginning of the end. The Atlantic Wall, which had consumed enormous resources and labour, had been breached at its strongest point. The psychological impact on German defenders throughout Normandy was significant. The 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions, which had defended the Normandy sector, were shattered in the days following June 6th. By the end of June, both divisions had ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. The broader impact on World War II cannot be overstated. D-Day succeeded largely because operations like Pointe du Hoc succeeded. If the Rangers had failed, if those 6 guns had remained operational and had fired into the beaches during the critical hours of June 6th, the outcome at Omaha Beach might have been very different. The commemoration of Pointe du Hoc has evolved over the decades. In 1979, the French government formally transferred Pointe du Hoc to the American Battle Monuments Commission for perpetual care and maintenance. Today, Pointe du Hoc receives more than 400,000 visitors annually. The memorial at Pointe du Hoc is simple but powerful, a granite pylon positioned atop a German concrete bunker with tablets inscribed in French and English. The English inscription reads, "Here on June 6, 1944, elements of the United States 2nd Ranger Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder scaled the 100-foot cliffs and destroyed the German artillery battery that could have devastated the landings at Omaha and Utah beaches." In conclusion, the assault on Pointe du Hoc stands as one of the supreme examples of military courage and tactical innovation in the Second World War. The mission succeeded because it was executed by men who refused to accept failure. The Germans were correct in their assessment that the cliffs were nearly impregnable from the sea, but they failed to account for the training, determination, and tactical skill of the Rangers who climbed them. The Rangers were correct in their confidence that they could accomplish their mission, though the cost was higher than anyone had hoped. The 6 guns were destroyed, the coastal highway was cut, and the invasion succeeded. But that success was purchased with the blood of 135 men killed or wounded. The transformation of impossible to difficult to accomplished is the story of Pointe du Hoc. It began with a German defensive position that appeared unassailable. It continued with American planners who refused to accept that unassailable meant impossible. It climaxed with 225 Rangers who climbed 100 feet of sheer rock under fire because they had been trained to do exactly that and because their mission demanded it. The Rangers who survived went on to varied lives, but they remembered their fallen comrades. As the decades passed and the numbers of survivors dwindled, those who remained felt an increasing responsibility to ensure that the story of Pointe du Hoc was not forgotten. The final chapter of the Pointe du Hoc story is being written now, but the cliffs remain, and the memorial stands, and the story endures of 225 men who proved that with training, courage, and determination, there is no position that cannot be taken, no cliff that cannot be climbed, no objective that cannot be achieved.